anyway, let's talk about the Bible. So basically, there's a common criticism of Christianity, and it goes a little something like this. Christianity is wrong because a literal interpretation of Genesis is wrong, and if you interpret Genesis as anything other than literal, then you are cherry-picking and you are basically admitting the Bible is complete nonsense, because you can't even be bothered to defend the whole Bible. You know, and when the Bible comes under attack, you just start throwing things out. Clearly, you don't even believe in it, so why should anyone else? You know, you're just making stuff up as you go along. You're just coming up with these ad hoc responses. You're saying, oh, that doesn't count, that's a metaphor, blah, blah, blah. Really, let's be real. The reality is that Genesis, literally interpreted, is nonsense, and there's no reason to think that the Bible shouldn't be taken as asserting Genesis as literal truth. Now, admittedly, the first premise here is pretty compelling. Now, I've said before that I'm not big into science, but the reality is that young Earth creationism, meaning that the Earth was like made 6,000 years ago, is such a absurdly recent date that it literally begins to step on the toes of humanity. So even though I'm not like super into science, you know, going back millions of years or anything like that, or even hundreds of thousands of years, I am into humanities, which extends, you know, beyond 6,000 years into the past, especially when you talk about things like Noah's Ark, and, you know, the literal flood, which apparently happened only 4,000 years ago. So it's like you're listening to your Egyptian history podcast and you have to be like, well, why doesn't it have anything about the flood that happened in 2000 BC? But also, of course, you know, I'm pretty into linguistics. And one of the things in linguistics is you hear about kind of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and that they kind of lived, you know, in the Eurasian steppes thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. And again, before apparently the Earth was even made, was when the Proto-Indo-Europeans were knocking around. And I just think to myself, you know, again, without even getting into the science, there's just like so much stuff which, if you're going to believe in the literal creation account, so much stuff that you just kind of have to like ignore. And you just have to be like, oh yeah, that's, you know, like you're trying to kind of get by in the world, learning about things, engaging with academia, and you just have to be confronted with so many times when just everything in academia would seem to contradict the idea that the Earth was 6,000 years old and made in 6 literal days of creation. And ultimately, you know, even if you want to assert that like the evolutionists are in some kind of conspiracy or something like that, that becomes a bit of an issue when just other academic disciplines seem to line up with, you know, an old Earth just like naturally. Like the thing is, it's not just evolution, kind of, you know, Darwinian evolution versus creation. It's Darwinian evolution and huge amounts of natural science plus huge amounts of other kind of, you know, like social sciences and humanities, all contradicting the literal Genesis account. So I don't have a problem with saying that the literal Genesis account is not necessarily the kind of thing that it would make much sense to believe. So obviously you might guess that my objection is therefore going to be the second part of this criticism of the Bible, where of course it said, well, if you think that the Bible should not be taken literally, you are just cherry picking. You're just saying, oh, you don't care about this. And here's the thing. It's not cherry picking, because like cherry picking would be like saying, okay, we're going to keep that, but we're not going to keep that. We're going to keep that. But like, it's basically, you know, like what's a cherry? Okay. A cherry is a small thing. And that's what cherry picking is. You know, it's taking one small thing. So it's like if I said, for example, well, this parable by Jesus is real, but this parable isn't. Or like basically it would be cherry picking is like verse to verse, maybe chapter to chapter, but certainly not, and this is the key point, vast swathes of text being analyzed in their proper context. The reality is that when somebody says, well, Genesis shouldn't be taken literally, that's not cherry picking, because it's not a cherry, is it? It's a pretty substantial portion of the Bible, and they're treating it that way. And the reality is that I interpret huge amounts of the Bible differently from other parts of the Bible, but it's not cherry picked. So, for example, and I'll kind of get into broadly kind of my take on the different parts of the Bible. Obviously, you have a large portion of the Bible. I'm not necessarily going to go through this in chronological order, but large portions of the Bible are kind of just prophetic, or like they're messages. It's not actually like history. Now, there are historical elements, for example, in the book of Daniel, and also Isaiah and Ezekiel, where it's describing the lives of the prophets themselves, but large portions of it is like surface level metaphorical. Like, obviously it's metaphorical, similar to, for example, Jesus's parables. But like, it's when you hear for example, a story about a giant beast emerging from the ground, the reality is that's not talking about a literal giant beast, is it? Like, and it would be kind of silly to think it is. But again, this is often literally within the context of dreams people are having, visions people are having, huge amounts of the prophetic text. We would say, well, it should be read in line with the fact it's prophetic, in line with the fact it's dreams, it's visions, it's ideas that will be kind of complicated and cerebral, but not history. It's there are portions of history in it, but we wouldn't say that they are historical books. The history is often just setting the scene. Of course, also, for example, there are the epistles. People always talk about the Bible as if it's some narrative, but the epistles, which take up like the end of the Bible, the ending portion of the Bible, and they're not a small part by any means. Like the vast majority of books in the New Testament are the epistles. And what are they? They are theological treatises. These are things exploring what concepts like salvation and sin mean. What was the significance of Jesus' life? These are theological treatises. They're not narrative books. So again, to say like, well, are you interpreting the Bible literally or figuratively? It's kind of just glossing over the fact that vast amounts of the Bible isn't even narrative. Of course, you also have the books of wisdom, the Psalms, the Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon is a love poem. To kind of say like, well, did this couple actually exist, is just profoundly missing the point. Nobody's arguing that the couple in the Song of Solomon literally existed. They might have, but it's pointless, because that's not, it's in the wisdom text. It's the wisdom texts are written on different facets of human experience. Obviously, you have the book of Job, which is about suffering. You have Ecclesiastes, which is about what's the purpose for life. You have the book of Solomon, or the Song of Solomon, which is about love. The love two people have for each other and exploring love. It's a love poem. And of course, also I mentioned Job. Job is about suffering. It's a poetry reflecting on the reality of suffering. And therefore, to say like, well, did Job really exist? Well, the actual answer is it doesn't matter, because it's the wisdom books. It's up there with Psalms and Proverbs. Job isn't there so you can be like, oh, let me read my history book about Job. No, it's there so you can read Psalms and Proverbs giving you advice for life, and then you can turn to this other book giving you advice for life, looking at how we should respond to and deal with suffering in the world. And in the exact same way, you can look to Song of Solomon and think, how should we feel about the reality of love, interpersonal love. And obviously, the exact same way you can look to the epistles and see, well, how should we feel about Jesus and his life, and how should we organize the church and organize our lives in light of our Christian faith? But then, of course, there are historical books. And of course, for example, you have the Gospels, which are generally regarded as incredibly reliable historical accounts. Certainly from a Christian perspective they are, but of course from a secular perspective, large amounts of it are regarded as quite reliable. And certainly, I know that even atheist New Testament scholars have said that Jesus' death is one of the most certain facts of antiquity. And of course it is, because you have 4 separate accounts, in fact 5 actually, because you've got the writings of, in fact 6, because you also have Josephus. But yeah, basically you have a huge number of separate accounts, all written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. I think that's true for all of them. All written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. And basically, the one thing I'm actually kind of doubting is Josephus. I think he might have been towards the beginning of the 2nd century. But even then, that would actually still be within the lifetime of at least some eyewitnesses. But anyway, basically, all of these accounts, all saying Jesus died on the cross. So what do we conclude? We conclude Jesus died on the cross. That's not really in doubt. But obviously, most Christians would say, well, actually, yeah, the entire Gospels are accurate. Now, that doesn't mean that they're literally word for word accurate. Of course, they're kind of accurate in the same way that a newspaper is accurate. Obviously, I did my master's in journalism, and one of the things you learn is you fiddle with what people write. You don't misrepresent it, but it's kind of one of those situations where there's something being true in terms of literal truth, and then there's something being true in spirit. And a lot of the time, if the actual literal words somebody wrote were a bit unwieldy, maybe a bit unclear, you can simplify it as long as you maintain the true spirit of what they were saying. And that's what I think with the Gospels. Basically, it was more like kind of news style, where it's like it's called the good news. Yeah, basically people taking the actual things Jesus said, but of course actually editing it to some degree, filtering it through kind of a journalistic lens. But let's make this clearer, let's make this digestible, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And again, obviously there's always this question when you talk about kind of biblical exegesis, what exactly does truth mean? When I say the Bible's true, or when I say, for example, the Gospels are true, do I mean literally everything happens in the exact order, every single exact word was said, and there was no degree of kind of narrative adaptation? Well, no. What I would more compare kind of the Bible to generally, when I talk about the historical portions of the Bible, is a good biopic. And I say good biopic because we're not talking something like Bohemian Rhapsody, where it just completely makes it up and like adds in all of these massive extra details that really do change things, but more like a good biopic that actually takes the real events that happened and just moves them around a little bit, maybe to make it structure a little bit better, but ultimately, and flow a little bit better, but ultimately, yeah, keeping everything as it really was. And that's my take on the Gospels. It's also, of course, my take on the majority of the history presented in the Bible. And when I talk about that, what I'm really talking about is everything from Exodus right through to Esther. So we all know the historical books of the Bible, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. All of those books are giving an accurate account of the history they're describing, but with that I'm not trying to imply that there isn't any kind of editorial filter when it's kind of like being repurposed to fit a narrative. I think that's just the reality of how histories were written in the past. And I think actually there are even, other histories, for example, like contemporary ancient Greek histories, which were, again, kind of more focused on that idea of a narrative and telling the story rather than necessarily being too bogged down in everybody knowing the exact details. And again, I don't think that's an inferior form of truth. I think that actually, in many ways, I think it is actually sticking to the idea of you get to the spirit of the story rather than necessarily the literal truth. But again, the point is that's kind of my take. And then obviously the only thing you have left after that, once you get rid of the prophetic books, the epistles, the wisdom, the gospels, the history books, and also, Exodus isn't technically counted as history, but it's just not put in the same, it's not officially history, but that's how I interpret it as history. You're left with Genesis. It's the only book left after all that. But you'll notice that even without having got into Genesis, I've already just said all of these different reasons why I interpret these books different ways. And you'll notice that I didn't at any point say, well, I interpret this way because it would be inconvenient to interpret it any other way. I don't interpret the epistles a particular way because it would be inconvenient to interpret them any other way. That's just not how I do it. I interpret them this way because I think it makes sense to interpret them this way. But the reality is that obviously, like I say, it's not nitpicking because we're talking about, vast amounts. This isn't, well, I interpret this book this way and this book this way and this way and this way. No, it's actually, the Bible is organized in a way which actually makes it so that different texts with different kind of purposes are put together. And when you get to Genesis, of course, this is the one place where I really say, well, actually now, it's, of course, I think, in some sense touching on history. But actually, when you get to Genesis, first of all, it's worth noting, it seems like some people seem to think that Genesis is just the creation of the world, or like Noah. The reality is that so Genesis chapters 1 to 11 is basically it ends with the Tower of Babel. And then Genesis 12 to 50 is telling the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, the kind of, those successive generations of the patriarchs of Israel. So you have, those stories. And my take is that Genesis 12 to 50 is legendary. It's not, in my opinion, likely to be as much literal history as Exodus through to Ezra or the Gospels. And Genesis 1 to 11, I would say, is ultimately mythical. It's not true. And you could say, well, it might be very loosely based on real events, but no, the reality is the Tower of Babel, the great worldwide flood, and the creation of the world in 6 days, these are things which basically didn't happen. Now, obviously, again, I would stress, this is not cherry picking. Just because, and it's just literally not cherry picking, because that's not what cherry picking is. Cherry picking would be if I said Genesis 3 is literal, but then Genesis 4 is metaphorical, and move. But no, I'm just saying, you have mythical, and then it transitions to legendary, and then it transitions to historical. That's not nitpicking or cherry picking. It's just a pretty clear progression, which is beholden to the structure of how the Bible is laid out. But the other key point is, and this is quite important, there's a justification for why I think this. And it's actually a really easy justification. It's a justification that you get just by looking at the Bible. And quite simply, when you actually look at the way the Bible treats history, and I would like to start by reading for you the introduction to the book of Luke. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also for me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Now, here's the thing, okay? What you're getting here is Luke writing to the patron of this book. Luke is writing to this Theophilus person because back in the day, there weren't state-funded universities or anything like that. One of the ways that you would, if you were somebody who was interested in history, one of the ways that you would go about writing historical accounts was by seeking out wealthy patrons. And the good news about Christianity is that there were lots of people who had an investment in the story, and therefore Luke was able to find this Theophilus person who was able to fund Luke writing all of this stuff down and investigating it and researching it. And obviously he really does stress in those texts there that he researched this. There's actually another bit in I think it might be Philippians, where it says it talks about the prophets who inquired and researched and studied. And obviously when you actually look at the Gospels, it's very clear that the Gospels were written by historians. The Gospels were written by people who went, and this is why the idea, the Jesus myth theory is not taken seriously by anybody, because it's just obviously not true. Actually, it's very clear that there are clear hallmarks of, is that the term I'm looking for, hallmarks? Of an actual historical account in the Gospels. These were written by historians who went out and researched and interviewed people and spoke with people and looked at early sources, and they came up with these gospel accounts. That, I don't think any reasonable person can deny that. I don't think any even secular scholar who seriously looks into the Bible will deny that, yes, this was a book which was written by historians who were engaged in historical research. And they were engaged in historical research at considerable expense. That's the reason why Luke needed to dedicate his gospel to Theophilus. And, the funny thing is that obviously people, obviously there's this idea that there's some kind of conflict between divine authorship and human authorship. And of course that conflict is complete nonsense. The reality is that there is no shame in the fact that, yes, the Bible was funded by human beings, that there is human influence behind the Bible in massive ways. And of course, this leads to the big point, which is why did they need to write like this? Why did they need to go out and research, look into stuff? Why did it matter so much that these people were contemporary with these events? Because why couldn't they just get the revelation from heaven, right? Like, why didn't they just, cloud descends upon them, their eyes kind of like, I don't know, start glowing or something, they start writing stuff down in a fury, and they just write the truth? Why didn't that happen? Because the thing is, in the Quran, it's very different. In the Quran, Muhammad, if he existed, and if he wrote the Quran, both those things very debatable, but Muhammad supposedly got a direct revelation which taught him word for word what to write down. So Muhammad was writing down histories. In the Quran, there is, the book of Joseph. It's Yusuf, but it's Joseph. It depends what your opinion is on whether or not we should pronounce Arabic names as Arabic or translate them. But yeah, basically, it has, a book on Joseph. It has stuff on Jesus and Mary. The reality is it has all of these stories about people who existed hundreds and even thousands of years before Muhammad. And how did Muhammad find that out? Did he go and research, listen to the eyewitnesses? No. Clearly, if you're going to believe in Islam, you kind of have to believe that information sticks around for a while, because our earliest sources about Muhammad don't show up until 200 years after he died. So you clearly have to believe that information sticks around for a little while if you're going to take this remotely seriously. But obviously, you don't have what we have with the Bible, where this was being written by people who lived through these events, or people who knew people who lived through these events. Muhammad was writing all this history down, significantly not even actually really knowing it was true. The authors of the Gospels clearly believed that what they were writing was true, because they'd researched it themselves. They'd done the effort to find out. Muhammad was writing this down because some angel on a mountain told him to do so. That's the Islamic narrative. So the point is that in the Quran and in Islamic theology and the Islamic idea of how scripture is written, God reveals historical information. But here's the big distinction. At no point in the entire Bible, it's a big book, a massive book, the Bible, and yet at no point does that ever happen. At no point in the Bible do we ever get an account of somebody being told a historical event so they can write it down, which is, significant. The reality is that every single piece of history in the Bible was written by people who knew about those events because they witnessed them or researched about them using methods available to them. They used human methods to establish the history they were writing. And at no point does anybody in the Bible ever use divine methods to write the history of the Bible. At no point does anyone ever go, go and pray and go up to the rock and speak to the angel, and the angel will tell you about King David. No. King David, the story of King David, was written contemporary with King David. The Chronicle was written contemporary with the kings of the time. Ezekiel was written, and Jeremiah was written contemporary with Ezekiel and Jeremiah. I realize those are prophetic books, but I'm speaking specifically about the historical content of them. The reality is that these books were written by people who witnessed them, as far as we can tell, and we certainly get clear examples of when people, we actually do have examples of the Bible being written, described within the Bible. And in all cases, it's people writing about events that they are there to directly witness. We have no counterexamples of any point where anybody's ever given miraculous information so they can write it down, like miraculous historical information, so they can say, okay, yeah, good, thanks for filling in the gap there. So here's an incredibly important question. Who wrote Genesis? Now, the funny thing is that the answer is Moses, and we actually have, even in the book, in the Old Testament, in the Torah, the first example of the Bible having been written down in the Bible. So in other words, the first account of the Bible being written can be found in the Bible. And I'll actually find it for you. So it's in Exodus 17:14. They just defeat the Amalekites, and then it says in 17:14, then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. So there we go. That's the story. God says, write this down. And it's pretty reasonable to conclude, considering we've just read an account of the defeat of the Amaleks, or the Amalekites, that what we are reading is the very account that Moses was told to write down. So, first of all, the key point there is that we have an example of the kind of, the way that the history that was written by Moses was written. He was told to write down the stuff he experienced and the stuff he witnessed, and that's how we get the Bible. Now, it's worth noting that the idea that Moses wrote Genesis is disputed, but it's important to bear in mind this is an example of, if you're going to dispute this, think for a second about whether or not it's actually relevant, because essentially the point I'm making is that Genesis was written by a human author who lived at the time of Moses' time. Now, the only dispute somebody could have here is saying, well, actually, it was written later than the time of Moses. But if you can roughly predict where it is I'm going with this, then you will see that this actually would only further enhance my point, because what's the point I'm going to make here? If we look through the Bible, and this is all we're doing, looking through the Bible, and we're asking the question, how does biblical authorship work in relation to the truth claims of the Bible? And we come to a pretty obvious conclusion. What makes the Bible reliable, what makes the literal information presented to us reliable, is that it's being written by people who, using human methods, are able to arrive at historical truth. And with that said, it would make sense to interpret Genesis in light of the limitations to Moses' knowledge. And specifically, what does this mean? Well, it means, first of all, that Genesis 12 to 50, this is, of course, telling a story, like I say, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. It ends with Joseph settling in Egypt, and that, of course, sets things up for Moses. Now, here's the thing. Moses probably heard about this. He probably heard the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And the reality is that this is probably based on actual historical events. It's probably based on the fact that these people actually did come to Egypt and did settle there. And with that said, Moses is writing this because he has some awareness of it, but this is hundreds of years after the fact in the case of Abraham. So it's quite likely that this information isn't totally accurate. Because again, there wasn't some magic angel there to tell Moses exactly what happened. All Moses could go on was what he would have heard from his community that had been settled in Egypt, and the stories they told about the men who established their nation hundreds of years ago. And that's all Moses has to go off. So when you realize that, of course it makes sense that this would be legendary. This would be a little bit like how the stories of Robin Hood were kind of set in the 13th century, but or maybe the 12th century, but they don't really start to get written until like the 15th and 16th century. So that's like several hundred years separating the legend of this person from the actual events. The reality is, and again, you could say, well, hold on a minute, Robin Hood probably didn't exist at all. But the point I'm just making is generally you have this idea that legends take a good few hundred years to establish. But yeah, that's probably it. And obviously in this case, I think there was more truth to it than the Robin Hood example, but I still think it's reasonable to say, well, yeah, this would not have been as accurate as everything else written in the Bible, which was written contemporary. People often say, well, if you're going to say that Genesis is not literal truth, then why would you say, for example, the Gospels are literal truth? And it's like, well, because the Gospels were written by people who knew eyewitnesses or were eyewitnesses themselves. Genesis wasn't. Genesis was written by Moses, who lived hundreds of years after Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Now, here's the thing, though. When you get to Genesis 1 to 11, we're not talking hundreds of years we're almost, I mean, for some of it, we're talking thousands of years. You know, the reality is that this stuff was incredibly removed from the life of Moses. The reality is, let's be 100% just open about this. Moses didn't know any of this. Moses didn't know how the world was created. He didn't know what happened in 2000 BC when he was alive in like 1400 BC. He didn't know these things. And here's the issue. If you're going to claim Moses did know these things, if you're going to interpret the Bible, Genesis, literally, and you're going to say Moses did know these things, then you have to be arguing that the story of Genesis 1 to 11, while historical, was assembled in a totally different way to all the other historical accounts in the Bible. You have to argue God made an exception for this one part of the Bible. And here's the key thing, and this is what you should notice now. I'm not cherry picking. I'm applying a consistent principle to the entire Bible. So this idea that by interpreting Genesis non-literally I'm cherry picking is the complete opposite. I'm not cherry picking. I'm saying, here's our principle. The Bible, the historical parts of the Bible, were always written by people who had direct, available knowledge about this information. And therefore, when you get back to Genesis 1 to 11, where there is no way Moses would have had any information about this, there's no way Moses had any information about what had happened over 500 years and up to like 2,500 years before he was even born. There's no way he had this information. So, the reality is that I'm applying a consistent principle and saying, therefore, it's not historical, or if we are to say it's historical, we're to say it's entirely speculative and not to be taken as truth. If somebody's going to argue the opposite and say, actually, no, Genesis is historical, but it was written under a completely different rule of authorship than every other book. Every other book, the authors of the historical works knew the information because it was directly available for them through human means. But Genesis, you get this completely unexplained and unaccounted for exception. At no point in the rest of the Torah, as we're getting the kind of continuation of the life of Moses, do we ever get a story of, and then God revealed all of this information magically to Moses so he could accurately describe the creation of the world. The reality is that when I say that Genesis 1 to 11 is not literal history, I'm not cherry picking. You can't accuse me of cherry picking. That argument against the correctness of the Bible, the validity of the Bible, doesn't stand up, because simply using biblical principles based on the way the Bible is presented to us and the actual textual evidence within the Bible, we conclude that applying the consistent principle of how history is written throughout the Bible, we come to the conclusion that Genesis was not literal. It's only by actually cherry picking and saying, no, in this specific case, we're going to make an exception and say that this bit of the Bible was written differently, that we come to the conclusion Genesis was literal. Now, there is, of course, a question, which is, why write Genesis? And does this make Genesis wrong? Was Genesis incorrect? And what I want to say is, first of all, that while historical truth isn't communicated to biblical authors at any point in the Bible, theological truth is. The gospel, according to Paul, was received from God directly. The reality is that Paul's theology, we have to assume, comes from God, because this isn't something, Paul couldn't find out through human means the truths that Paul explains in the epistles. So we have to come to the conclusion that these truths came from God directly. And of course, Paul then affirms, isn't that a funny thing, when we have, the Bible it's fantastic. And it gives us this information to work with, this information about how the Bible was written. So when it's a historical event, we get the account of human beings using their own knowledge to establish this stuff. But when it's a theological truth, we get Paul saying, I received this directly from God. So that's how it works. If it's a theological truth, you receive it directly from God because it's God telling you about himself. So this is something which makes sense. And there is a lot of, so we can imagine, therefore, that while Moses could not have presented historical truth in Genesis 1 to 11, because that information was not available to him, he could easily have presented theological truth contained that would have been available to him. That knowledge would have been available to him because it was available to many prophets throughout history. So, with that said, you look at the theological truths in terms of, for example, our sin separating us from God, the knowledge of good and evil, obligating us to choose good. That's what separates us from the animals. We know the difference between good and evil. We are morally accountable for our actions. That's a very significant theological truth. And there's also, of course, the fact that there's a potential paradise when we bring our will into submission with God. And of course, there's also all of the very significant prophetic stuff about the Son of Man crushing the head of the serpent. In Genesis, it says that the serpent is death, and the Son of Man, or rather the Son of Eve, actually, but man meaning human being, the Son of Eve, a human being, will crush the head of the serpent, but the serpent will bite the heel of the man. And what is that? It's Jesus, right? It's a messianic prophecy about Jesus. Jesus crushes the head of the serpent representing, if you like, human rebellion, sin, death. It doesn't necessarily have to just represent one thing, but that's pretty clearly what the serpent represents. And the Son of Man, Jesus, a human being born of a woman, crushes the serpent's head, but the serpent bites the heel of Jesus. What's that? That's Jesus dying on the cross. This is a really significant messianic prophecy, and that's kind of the point. All of this stuff is contained within the book of Genesis, and we wouldn't have this stuff otherwise. So while Genesis does not contain historical truth, because I would argue that's not its purpose, because it couldn't contain historical truth, because it wasn't written by anybody who witnessed these historical events, it does contain theological truth, because the Bible establishes that theological truth and kind of prophetic wisdom is available to all of the prophets throughout the Bible. So there we go. I think that's one reason, but there is, of course, another reason. And this is that. This was how it was assumed the universe was created at that time. Because here's the thing, okay? Everybody had a creation myth. And it was, therefore assumed that the way the universe came into existence was through a creation myth. So actually, all this is doing is inserting God into the standard understanding of how the universe was created. Everybody believed the universe was created through a creation myth. So this is inserting God into that creation myth. It's essentially inserting God into the common understanding of how the universe or the world was created. And therefore, it's functionally equivalent to somebody in the modern day saying God caused the Big Bang. And what ultimately are we saying when we say that? We're saying God created the universe, God created the world. Because we understand now that the way people today believe that the universe came into existence was the Big Bang. So if I were to sit down and write a story about God's relationship to human beings, how might I start it? I would start it by saying, in the beginning there was an infinitesimal speck of matter, and then that expanded rapidly because of God. God said, let there be light, and it expanded rapidly. What you'll notice is, what's the actual point I'm communicating there? The point I'm communicating is that God created the universe. But to explain that in a narrative way, I am using the current story we have for how the universe came into existence, and I'm inserting God into that story. I'm saying, and I would say, and then, the masses gathered together and the universe formed and all that kind of stuff. And eventually, obviously then, once I finish explaining how God created the universe, which means, in other words, using the information that's available to me in terms of how I'm told the universe was created, I'm inserting God into that to explain God created the universe, then I move on to talking about the actual history that's more available to me. In an exactly identical sense, Moses sits down and thinks, well, how am I going to write this narrative about the relationship between God and human beings? How am I going to start it off? And he thinks, well, I'll start it off with, God created the universe, of course. I'll start off with God creating the universe. So what does he do? He takes the stories around him, the creation myths, and he inserts God into them. And the key thing here is that just because I write God created the Big Bang, we wouldn't interpret that as meaning that the Big Bang becomes, true by dint of me saying that. The evidence for the Big Bang exists in the evidence of the people who believe it, who are contemporary to me, And in the same way, the reason why people believed in the myths of the past is because it was what people believed at that time. It was the human knowledge at that time was it's probably just like some all powerful person just declared it all into existence. So again, and here's the thing: if I wrote the Big Bang blah blah blah, and then later on it turns out that actually it wasn't the Big Bang, it was something else. It was some other kind of theory, and people have a whole new idea of how the universe came into existence. Well, then perhaps a future generation would more properly say, well, God did it this way instead. What you'll notice is that actually it's, God did it this way. No, God did it this way. No, God did it this way. The only thing that's changing here is human knowledge. It used to be humans thought it was this, then humans thought it was this. Maybe later on humans will think it was this. But the truth that God was the one who did it remains the same. So it's not, Moses was using the knowledge available to him at the time, or the theory, the understanding available to him at the time, that there was a creation myth where things were just like declared into existence. He's using that to declare the much more substantial truth that God created the universe. And it's argued that the Genesis has lots of kind of parallels to other ancient Near Eastern myths. And if that's true, this would just further substantiate that point, that Moses was writing and saying, well, let me insert God into these myths to communicate to people that God was the person who did this. And yeah, all Moses is functionally doing is saying God created the universe, but he's doing that in a narrative way, using the existing contemporary narrative of how the universe was created and then inserting God into it in the exact same way that I might do that today with the Big Bang. That's my take on it, and I think it's a pretty reasonable take. So I want to conclude with a pretty significant point. So first of all, I don't think it makes sense to just reflexively call things cherry-picking without actually thinking through what's really being said. That's a very key point. But second of all, I think there's this idea that people have of like that biblical interpretation is trying to catch up with science, and science is like very clear, very established, very undeniable, but biblical interpretation is messy, it's foggy, it's all over the place, and therefore it's malleable to science. But it's interesting because I've argued with people who are young Earth creationists, and what I consistently notice is they throw science at me. They say, let me send you this documentary about the DNA strand and how it could never have come about through natural selection. They say, let me show you this kind of a Discovery Science channel, which is showing how the whale couldn't have evolved from aquatic mammals because we have different kind of species from all over the place, dated to all sorts of different dates, and it just doesn't make any sense. Let me show you, whatever else it is. All of these different kind of nitpicks people have, and I don't think those nitpicks are correct. Genuinely, I think the science probably falls unambiguously down on the side of Darwinian evolution being correct. But I personally don't know the science. I'm not a science person, so I just kind of listen to it and think, okay, I'm not sure. But the point is, all of these people, they all have this science which they think is on their side, and they have a lot of it. And sure, is it misrepresented? Is a lot of it bunk? Is a lot of it nonsense? I would suspect so. But they have it and they present it and say, this is truth, this is scientific truth. The funny thing is that these people throw science at me and I throw the Bible back at them. I say, well, hold on a minute. If you're arguing that Genesis is literal, why do you think Moses knew all of this stuff? When that does not seem to be consistent with how history is written throughout the Bible as it's presented. Admittedly, I don't know much about the science, so maybe it's not surprising, but obviously I've never changed somebody's mind by just hitting them with the science, like the science that proves evolution is true. But I have changed people's minds on this topic by hitting them with the Bible. These people who have been able to imagine, like, come up with their own kind of scientific explanation. Like, no, actually, science, the science revolution is not valid. This science is much more convincing. They've made science conform to what it is they want to believe. But when I confront them with the Bible, and I say, well, how do you explain this? How does this make sense? Why do you make this one particular exception for Moses in terms of how the Bible was written? Why do you assume that Moses suddenly miraculously had this particular knowledge in Genesis 1 to 11? And they say, oh, I don't know. And, obviously sometimes they just ignore it. But I've changed people's minds with this. And that's kind of the funny thing. I think people have this idea like science is just this unalterable, like unarguable, like science is going to descend upon you and just give you the truth and you can't deny it. But I've never seen that happen, I see people all the time like picking their own science, making up their own science, manipulating science. What's surprising is a lot of the time when you confront somebody with biblical, and this whole narrative of like, oh, you can just interpret the Bible any way you want. No. When you confront people with biblical truth, they don't just reinterpret it. Or they might try to, but when you keep hitting them with it, it reaches a point where they either accept it or they run from it. Because there's only so much you can twist what's pretty clear and obvious. So yeah, that's kind of my take. I think this whole idea of like, oh, well, the Bible just gets messed around, you just cherry pick and just move everything around to make it fit with science, because science is perfect and concrete and undeniable. And it's like, I do agree science is true. I agree science is very literally true. But I don't think it's undeniable. I think a lot of people deny it. And yet, I have seen people be confronted with the Bible and find it undeniable. So I'm not sure I'm really buying this idea that people are just like taking the Bible and making it malleable and making it graft onto modern science through their strange interpretations. No, I think that actually both science and the Bible are true, objectively so, and that actually they are clear and they're concise and they're coherent and they line up. And obviously the Bible is not a science textbook. I'm not suggesting that actually, there's all these scientific miracles. No, the Bible's got nothing to do with science. But the point is the Bible doesn't contradict science. And I suppose actually it's just two other things I should say. First thing is people might say, oh, you're just interpreting this way because you can't explain Genesis 1 to 11. But here's the thing. I also interpret Job as metaphorical, and it's because it's placed in the wisdom books. But it's not as if like there's any science disproving Job. There's nothing, there's no science that could disprove the book of Job. But I still don't believe it, or don't believe it was literal, because it's in the wisdom books. It's a book about suffering and the nature of suffering. Similarly, Exodus is actually quite a difficult book because it does seem to, like it doesn't graft perfectly onto actual established Egyptian history. It would be very convenient if I could just say, oh, Exodus is just literal. Oh, sorry, Exodus is just metaphorical. But I can't because, again, my consistent system wouldn't allow me to do that. I think Exodus was written by Moses, who experienced these events. Therefore, I think that it's true. So the reality is that if you're going to say, well, you just have like these interpretations to make it fit with, what's convenient. Well, there are instances where it provides no convenience at all believing it's metaphorical, but I still believe it's metaphorical because I think that's the proper way to understand the text. And there are instances where it would provide a massive benefit if I could say it was metaphorical, but I don't because I think that that wouldn't be the proper way to understand the text. One final thing I do just quickly need to say. Some people will kind of argue, well, Genesis must be literal because it's referred to as though it was real in the New Testament. And here's the thing. No, that's not true. Okay, I'll just say really quickly like two things. So first of all, like people just saying like the fact that it refers to Adam and all those kind of people as if they're real. Well, there is no as if they're real. Because the reality is that if you think that something is a useful metaphor, then you might just continue that metaphor, which means still referring to it. When people say, well, Adam was alive here and he did this thing, that's still fine as a metaphor. There's no reason it ceases to be a metaphor. If I start talking about Adam and all the things Adam did and the experience of Adam and how Adam betrayed God by eating the fruit of knowledge, that's not contradicting the idea of him being a metaphor, right? Because I could still mean it in a metaphorical sense. A good rule here for me is like, if I want to think, well, what's an impossible interpretation here? I think, well, might I say that exact thing? And there is nothing in the Bible said about Adam in the New Testament that I would not be comfortable saying, because I would be perfectly comfortable continuing Adam as a metaphor for humanity, and talking about the things Adam experienced. And there's a bit in the Bible where, and this is the final thing, people say, well, it theologically matters that Adam was a particular individual, because it says, well, the sin came into the world through the actions of one man, Adam, and therefore we can be saved by sin saved from sin by the actions of one man, Jesus. And they say, well, hold on a minute, Jesus is obviously not metaphorical. So how does it make sense to say Adam is metaphorical? It seems like, we're talking about us being literally saved from sin by one literal man, Jesus. So wouldn't it make sense to say that we're saved? We were brought literally into sin by one man, Adam. And to me, here's the thing. Basically, this depends on whether or not you think Paul's trying to make a very strict theological point here, or if you think he's just trying to illustrate a point so people understand it. And my take is pretty simply, I think he's trying to illustrate a point. This idea that it doesn't really make any sense, because if you think he's trying to make a literal theological point, you would be implying that Jesus is not more powerful. Because here's the thing, okay, what if every single human being was responsible for their own sin rather than it all going back to Adam? Are you suggesting now that Jesus would not be able to save us from our sin? Because I believe that Jesus is God and he's all powerful. That's my take. Are you disagreeing with that? Are you saying Jesus isn't all powerful, that the only reason Jesus was able to save us from sin is because it was only one man responsible for it? And if every man was responsible for his own sin, again, I'm using man, sorry, it's just a thing. I use man to mean humanity. If every human was responsible for their own sin, suddenly Jesus wouldn't be able to do it because that's too much for Jesus? No. The reality is that theologically, Jesus could save us from sin. One man can save us from sin. If that man is Jesus, the man God, 100% man and 100% God, if that's Jesus and that's the man saving us, it doesn't matter if every single human being on the planet is responsible for their own sin. Jesus is still, his sacrifice was sufficient to save everybody. So I don't think that the idea that this is like some kind of theological point matters. But if it's an illustration saying, well, one person can commit us to sin, one person can take us out of sin, then actually it works perfectly fine if that's metaphorical. It's saying, well, we have this metaphor for this idea of everybody being brought into sin by the actions of one man. So in a similar sense, we can understand the idea of everybody being brought out of sin by one man. It's an illustration. And of course, obviously theology is filled with illustrations where you don't then have to get get worked up trying to understand it as some kind of literal thing where you're like, well, what? The Trinity is like water and it's like ice and vapor and liquid and that's like, again, these are illustrations. So I don't think it's an issue. There we go. So that was just a quick point. I probably should have put it somewhere else in the video, but I forgot to write it in my notes. So it's kind of like just what I'm concluding on. So, but yeah, again, obviously the point I'm making here is I think it makes sense just reading the Bible itself to interpret Genesis as metaphorical. And therefore, I guess I should have, those are the only two examples I'm aware of, like kind of just the general idea of people talking about Adam. And obviously Jesus talks about Adam, lots of people talk about Adam, and then that more specific case of Paul making that exact, it's in Romans, but I can't remember exactly where. I might put it up in the description or something. Anyway, that's that. Hope you enjoyed. I get positive feedback on my theology videos. People say, "Oh, I find this really interesting." So I hope you found this interesting. Again, obviously, I know a lot of you are kind of sat there thinking, like, again, obviously, most people I understand probably don't really believe the Bible who are watching this. But what I'm saying here is I'm presenting to you how you can believe the Bible, and these issues like evolution and how should Genesis be interpreted and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't create an issue. I assume that maybe you would like to. I like to think you would recognize me as a kind of quite intelligent, rational person, and therefore you may wonder, well, how does he deal with all these issues? And what I'm hoping to present in these videos as they kind of progress is, well, this is how. And I think actually the arguments are quite strongly on my side and the Bible's side in this regard. So yeah, thank you for watching. Hope you all enjoy. Bye.